I picked up a bundle of dried hyssop this morning, and the smell stopped me cold. Not because it was strange, because it wasn't. My grandmother grew it, her mother grew it, and somewhere between their generation and mine, we all forgot why. That plant is in the Bible, Psalm 51, Exodus 12. And it wasn't put there as decoration. Around number 11, I'll show you a plant most people are actively pulling out of their yards, one the Israelites mourned losing in the desert. And number 2, nearly every ancient household kept it for pain, fever, and digestion. It's in your kitchen right now. Here are 20 biblical plants, counted down from 20 to 1, with the preparation knowledge that actually made them work. If that's what you came for, subscribe and let's start. Number 20, the purification plant. Hyssop shows up in Psalm 51 and Exodus 12, and most people read those passages as spiritual metaphor. Purify me with hyssop. Sprinkle the blood with hyssop. They assume the plant was chosen for its symbolism. Small, humble, a brush. That's not the whole story. I keep a pot of hyssop right outside my back door. When I crush a leaf between my fingers, it smells like medicine. Sharp, almost medicinal sweet, like something you'd expect to find in a pharmacy if pharmacies used to grow things, because it is medicine. The plant contains thymol, the same compound that goes into commercial vapor rubs and some antiseptic mouthwashes. But hyssop has been used this way for centuries before anyone isolated the molecule. Traditionally, dried hyssop was steeped in near-boiling water and the steam breathed in for chest congestion and respiratory complaints. The leaves were also prepared as a wash, not a drink, a wash, applied to wounds and skin irritations. When the priests of Israel used hyssop to sprinkle water, oil, or blood during purification rituals, they weren't being arbitrary. They chose a plant with antimicrobial properties and used it in cleansing. The ritual and the function were the same thing. Today, people buy vapor rub containing synthetic thymol pressed into petroleum jelly. The real plant grows in a 6-inch pot on a windowsill and does most of the same job without the petroleum. The Bible told people to use this plant before scientists had a name for what was in it. From purification, we go to something you've likely eaten this week without thinking twice. Number 19, the wilderness bread herb. In Exodus 16:31, the manna that fell in the desert is described as tasting like wafers made with honey and looking like coriander seed. In Numbers 11.7, that description appears again, white as coriander. The comparison only works if every single person listening already knew exactly what coriander seed looked like. It wasn't a poetic reach. It was shorthand for something universally recognized. I grow coriander every spring. The seeds dry on the stalk if I leave them, and then I harvest them and crush them into nearly everything. Soups, flatbreads, even a warm seed tea when my stomach is unsettled from a heavy meal. The plant is dual purpose from root to tip. The leaves, which most people know as cilantro, were used fresh. The seeds, dried, were used as a digestive aid and a mild preservative in food preparation. The oil expressed from the seeds was applied to skin irritations. It's a deeply practical plant that asks almost nothing of you. You sow it, water it occasionally, and it delivers 2 different medicines from the same stem depending on when you harvest. The people crossing that desert knew this plant well enough that God used it to describe something miraculous. Maybe we should at least know it too. Number 18, the tithe herb. In Matthew 23:23, Jesus rebukes the Pharisees for tithing mint, dill, and cumin while neglecting justice and mercy. People read this as commentary on religious hypocrisy. They're right, but they miss the embedded information. You tithe what has value. You count what costs something. The Pharisees were tithing mint because mint was worth tithing. Mint spreads like it owns the place. My grandmother kept hers in a separate clay pot sunken into the soil, not to decorate the border, but to contain it. She used it every week. Tea for a sick stomach, crushed leaves pressed to the temples when a headache came on, a handful steeped in warm water and used as a cooling rinse in summer. She didn't consult anything, she just knew. Menthol, the compound that gives mint its coolness, has been used topically and aromatically across essentially every culture that ever had access to the plant. For nausea, for headaches, for indigestion, for fever cooling. It works through basic physiological mechanisms that haven't changed. A plant that grows in any pot, in almost any climate, harvests multiple times per season, is nearly impossible to kill, and still delivers those properties anytime you need them. We put it in cocktails and call it a garnish. They counted every leaf at tax time. Number 17, the Passover medicine. Exodus 12:8 instructs that the Passover lamb be eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Most people absorb that detail as symbolic. The bitterness represents suffering in Egypt. The herbs mark a hard season. And that's true. The ritual carried that meaning. But the plants chosen were not random. The bitter herbs of Passover, wild lettuce, endive, chicory, dandelion, are plants high in sesquiterpene lactones, the compounds that make them taste bitter and that traditional healers across the Mediterranean world use specifically for liver and digestive support. Before a journey, especially a hard one, through a desert, eating unfamiliar food, bitter greens prepared the digestive system. They stimulated bile production. They helped the body process what was coming. I've eaten dandelion greens and endive my whole life without knowing the Passover connection. When I finally made it, it changed how I read that whole passage. They weren't eating bitter herbs because suffering should taste bitter. They were eating them because they were about to need their bodies to function well under pressure. That tradition, eating bitter greens in spring before the heavy work of the year began, persisted in essentially every traditional food culture well into the 20th century. We lost it when we started calling dandelions weeds and endive a restaurant garnish. They didn't eat bitter herbs because suffering tasted good. They ate them because they worked. Now stop here with me for a moment. 4 plants into this list and look at what we have. Hyssop for cleansing and respiratory support, coriander for digestion and preservation, mint for soothing and fever, bitter herbs for liver preparation before a journey. That's not a collection of curiosities. That's a maintenance system. None of those plants were emergency treatments. None of them were pulled out when someone was already desperately ill. They were built into meals, into rituals, into seasonal habits, into the very structure of religious observance. The Bible wasn't listing medicines for sick people. It was describing a culture that maintained health before illness arrived. They didn't wait for something to go wrong. Prevention was sewn into the calendar. We've swapped that for a reactive system. Wait until something breaks, then outsource the repair. That shift has cost us more than we know. And what's coming next on this list goes even deeper. Somewhere around number 11, you're going to find a plant that may be growing in your yard right now. One the Israelites mourned losing so badly they named it specifically in the desert. Keep watching. Number 16, the priest's anti-inflammatory. Most people know frankincense as one of the gifts brought to the baby Jesus. A precious thing, exotic, ceremonial. They don't think of it as medicine. But frankincense, the resin of the boswellia tree, was burned daily in the tabernacle as described in Exodus 30:34. It was also traded throughout the ancient Near East as one of the most valued medicinal substances available. The boswellic acids in the resin have been studied in modern contexts for their effects on inflammation, particularly joint inflammation and respiratory conditions. That research didn't invent the knowledge. It confirmed what practitioners had understood for 3,000 years. I burn frankincense resin in the winter when the air inside gets dry and thick and everyone's breathing runs shallow. I put small pieces on a heat-resistant dish over a tea light. The smoke is slow, not harsh, and the room smells different afterward. Cleaner, somehow quieter. I'm not performing a ritual. I'm doing something practical. The aromatic compounds in the smoke have real effects on the respiratory mucosa. Ancient priests understood this, even without the vocabulary. People now spend considerable money on boswellia extract capsules for joint support. The tree those capsules come from has been burned and traded for exactly this purpose since before the first temple was built. The priests weren't burning incense to set a mood. They were running a health protocol. Number 15, the wound resin. Myrrh tends to appear in the same breath as frankincense, which has caused people to file it away as another ceremonial exotic. But myrrh has a different story, and a more specifically medical one. Esther 2:12 describes a 12-month preparation ritual for the women entering the king's court. 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. That's not a beauty routine in the modern sense. Oil of myrrh applied over months was understood as a skin treatment, a preservative, a preparation of the body itself. In Mark 15:23, myrrh is offered to Jesus on the cross mixed with wine, traditionally understood as a pain-mitigating preparation. John 19:39-40 lists myrrh as part of the burial preparation alongside aloe. I keep a small jar of myrrh tincture, myrrh resin dissolved in alcohol, in my medicine cabinet alongside everything else I actually use. It has a dark amber color and a dense, slightly medicinal smell. I've applied it to small cuts and gum irritations for years. Terpenoid compounds in myrrh resin have documented antimicrobial properties, and its historical use as a wound-sealing agent is consistent across ancient Egyptian, Greek, Hebrew, and Roman sources simultaneously. That kind of convergence doesn't happen around things that don't work. They gave myrrh to a king at his birth and offered it to a dying man at the end. It served the living in between. Number 14. The desert healer. People think of aloe vera as a modern skincare ingredient, the clear gel squeezed from those plastic tubes after sunburn. Something new, something cosmetic. John 19:39-40 records that Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes for the burial of Jesus, approximately 75 Roman pounds of it. That is a significant quantity. The scale suggests medicinal and preservative use, not incidental fragrance. And aloe's documented history as a healing plant stretches back to Egyptian papyri, Mesopotamian records, and essentially every desert culture that ever had access to it. I keep an aloe plant growing on the shelf above my kitchen sink. It's been there for years. When I touch something hot, the edge of a pan, a coal that shifted wrong, I break a leaf and press the gel directly onto the burn. No mixing, no measuring, no waiting, just the plant. The gel contains compounds used across traditional medicine for skin soothing, minor wound care, and burn treatment, and it works fast enough that you notice it immediately. The scale at which it was brought to that burial, 75 pounds, suggests that whoever was preparing the body understood exactly what aloe does and wanted a lot of it. We grow one plant on a windowsill and still forget to use it. 7 plants in, and here is something that bothers me every time I think about it. Every plant I've named so far is still growing on this earth. Most of them are still available in garden centers, grocery stores, or specialty shops. Some of them are growing in your yard right now without you knowing what you're looking at. This knowledge didn't disappear because the plants went extinct. It disappeared because it became inconvenient. Because when it got cheaper to sell a pill than to teach a preparation, the preparation stopped being taught. The Bible didn't sell anything. It just wrote down what people already knew. What comes next is where it gets personal. Number 13, the slave's medicine. Numbers 11.5 is a passage most people skim past. The Israelites are in the desert. They're tired and frustrated, and they list the foods they miss from Egypt. They mention fish, they mention cucumbers and melons, and they mention, specifically, garlic, onions, and leeks. Not bread, not meat, not the substantial foods. These particular plants. That's not nostalgic food memory. That is a list of medicinal staples that people who understood their bodies knew they needed. Egyptian records document that laborers, including slaves working on major construction, received garlic rations, not as a treat, as a daily supplement to maintain physical endurance and resistance to illness. I crush 2 cloves of garlic every morning, not cooked, raw, pressed flat with the wide edge of a knife, left to sit for 5 minutes before I eat anything. I learned that from a woman in her late 80s who had never spent a night in a hospital. She did it every morning of her adult life without variation. The 5-minute rest matters. Crushing garlic initiates the conversion of alliin to allicin, and that reaction takes a few minutes to complete. Heat interrupts it, so cooking garlic before that window closes reduces the potency significantly. The garlic supplements at the pharmacy are dried, processed, deodorized. The chemistry that makes the plant relevant is largely destroyed to make it easier to swallow without the smell. The living plants those capsules came from would have done more. Slaves fought for access to this plant in the middle of a civilization that kept them in chains. We cook it until it can't do half of what it was supposed to. Number 12, the mourned vegetable. Right next to garlic in that Numbers 11.5 list, onions. And the tendency is to smile at that because it sounds like a complaint about cafeteria food. They miss their onions. But the people speaking those words were not talking about flavor preferences. My grandmother made onion poultices. When I had a bad winter cough as a child, she would roast a halved onion until it was soft all the way through, wrap it in a clean cloth, and press it to my chest while it was still warm. I thought it was old-fashioned. I endured it. And then my cough got better. I assumed it was coincidence until I was old enough to understand what quercetin is and what sulfur compounds do, and why every traditional culture from Central Europe to the ancient Near East maintained some version of the same treatment. Quercetin is a documented natural anti-inflammatory. The sulfur compounds that make you cry when you cut an onion have well-established antimicrobial and mucolytic properties. A warm poultice draws those compounds through the skin via heat and direct contact. You don't need to ingest anything. You don't need to prepare anything complicated. You need an onion and a cloth. The ancient world mourned losing onions from their diet in the middle of an otherwise extraordinary rescue from slavery. They didn't cry because the food was good. They cried because they knew what the plant did. Number 11, the weed you're pulling. And the third plant in that same verse, leeks. Most people in North America think of leeks as a gourmet vegetable, something you use in fancy potato soup. But wild leeks, the ramps that grow in moist woodland soil across the eastern part of this continent, are something else entirely. I had them growing along my fence line for years. I was mowing them down every spring. The smell should have told me what I had, that sharp, oniony, slightly sulfurous smell when the blade hit them. Once I knew what they were, I stopped mowing and started harvesting. Now I pull them in early spring before they flower and simmer them into a pale green broth that smells like the whole allium family in one pot. Wild leeks are rich in vitamin K folate and the same allium compounds that make garlic and onion medically interesting. Traditional use in broths during illness recovery is documented across European and indigenous North American traditions separately. The plant is self-seeding. It comes back every year. It costs nothing. The Israelites crossed a desert naming this plant specifically among their losses. You might be mowing it down every spring without a second thought. Let me stop here again because Numbers 11.5 just gave us something important. Garlic, onions, leeks. 3 plants in a single verse, listed together as a unit of grief. That's not coincidence. Those 3 plants form a complete allium protocol. Together, they cover antimicrobial function, respiratory support, anti-inflammatory action, digestive support, and immune maintenance. The ancient people eating them daily weren't combining them randomly. They understood, through practice, through tradition, through generations of observation, that these plants belonged together. The meal was the medicine. The garden was the pharmacy. Modern culture separated food and health into different buildings with different specialists and different receipts, and we are paying for that division in ways we're only beginning to understand. What comes next on this list requires even more knowledge to use correctly, because possessing a plant and knowing what to do with it are 2 entirely different things. Number 10, the universal carrier. Olive oil appears throughout the Bible as a healing medium. James 5:14 instructs elders to anoint the sick with oil. Luke 10:34 describes the Good Samaritan pouring oil and wine directly on wounds. It's easy to read those passages as ritual gestures, symbolic anointing, ceremonial care. But olive oil wasn't just a spiritual metaphor. It was the carrier. Every plant on this list that has a fat-soluble active compound, and most of them do, becomes more bioavailable, more skin-penetrating, and more effective when combined with oil. The ancient herbalists didn't separate the medicinal plant from the delivery system. They infused the oil with the plant. They let it sit in the sun or in gentle heat until the oil pulled out what water couldn't. Then they applied it where it needed to go. I do this every summer. I pack a glass jar with dried herbs, calendula, rosemary, sometimes hyssop, sometimes plantain leaf, and I fill it with good olive oil and set it in a south-facing window for 3 weeks. The oil changes color. It changes smell. What I pour out is not the same oil I poured in. That technology is older than the Bible. It's older than writing, but the Bible preserved the instruction to use it. Modern pharmaceutical topicals use petroleum-derived carriers because they're cheap, shelf-stable, and consistent. They work, but the people who made the original formulation used what they had, which happened to be a carrier with its own anti-inflammatory properties built in. The Good Samaritan didn't reach for a first aid kit. He reached for the oil and wine already in his bag because he knew what to do with what he had. Number 9, the prophet's poultice. This one has a chapter, a name, and a specific prescription. 2 Kings 27. The prophet Isaiah is standing before a dying king named Hezekiah. The king has a severe infected boil, and Isaiah says, "Take a lump of figs and lay it on the boil, and the king shall recover." He did. Now, the theological dimension of that account is real, and I'm not dismissing it. But the plant instruction is in there for a reason. Figs weren't chosen arbitrarily. Fresh figs contain phycin, a proteolytic enzyme, an enzyme that breaks down protein. Applied as a poultice to infected or inflamed skin, mashed figs have drawing and softening properties that are consistent with traditional wound treatment practices documented in Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and later Islamic medicine. The prescription makes sense. I've used a mashed fig compress on an infected splinter wound. I was skeptical. The wound had been hot and swollen for 2 days. I mashed a ripe fig, pressed it against the site, wrapped it in clean cloth, and left it overnight. By morning, the swelling had reduced and the splinter site had drawn to a visible point. I stopped being skeptical. A fig tree grows readily in temperate climates. It produces heavily. It requires no processing beyond mashing. And a prophet told a dying king to use it, and the king recovered. We put figs on cheese boards. Number 8, the temple fruit. Pomegranate was carved into the hem of the high priest's robe in Exodus 28. It's listed among the 7 species of the Promised Land in Deuteronomy 8:8, the foods that made the land worth inhabiting. It shows up in the Song of Solomon, in Numbers, in the decorative architecture of the temple itself. This is a plant so woven into the culture that it appears in their clothing, their poetry, their sacred buildings, and their dietary law. Today, pomegranate appears in juice bars and antioxidant marketing. Trendy, new, something discovered by food science. But the punic alagins and polyphenols that make pomegranate interesting to modern researchers were not discovered in a laboratory. They were used empirically, practically, across centuries, for fever management, intestinal complaints, and as a preservative. What most people don't know is that the rind is different from the fruit. The part modern people throw away is the part traditional practitioners used most. I grow a pomegranate in a container and bring it inside through winter. When the fruit ripens, I eat the seeds. The rind I dry and keep. Dried pomegranate rind crumbled into simmering water produces a deep amber decoction with an astringent, drying quality that traditional healers used for digestive complaints and intestinal inflammation. That knowledge, which part of the plant prepared in which way for which situation, is precisely what's been lost. They sewed it into sacred clothing. We put it in a bottle and call it new. Every plant I've named so far required something beyond possession. You can have hyssop in a pot and never steam it. You can have garlic in your kitchen and cook it before the allicin forms. You can throw away the pomegranate rind without knowing what you had. The plants are still here. What's been lost is the knowledge of preparation. When, how, which part, in what form, combined with what. The Bible preserved that knowledge inside stories, inside rituals, inside laws. The Passover meal told people which plants to eat before a journey. The tabernacle instructions told priests which resins to burn and when. The gospel accounts recorded specific preparations by name. The plants were the reminders. And what we're about to cover, Numbers 7 down to number 2, these aren't plants you casually eat. These are plants you study. Number 1 is going to reframe everything you've watched so far. Number 7, the purification wood. Cedar doesn't look like medicine. It looks like a building material. It smells like a closet liner, a chest, a moth repellent. People associate it with furniture and storage, not healing. But Leviticus 14 is specific. The ritual cleansing of skin disease required cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet thread burned together. 2 of the most medically active plants we've already discussed, hyssop with its thymol, combined with cedar. The combination wasn't ceremonial decoration. The priests who maintained those protocols were maintaining something that functioned. Cedarwood oil contains cedrol and thujopsine, compounds with documented antimicrobial and insecticidal properties. Ancient Mediterranean cultures used cedar oil to preserve food, treat wood against rot and insects, repel pests from stored grain, and apply to skin conditions. Cedar chests kept insects out of stored linens. Cedar burned in an enclosed space changed the quality of the air. I burned cedar in my wood stove through the deep winter months. The whole house smells different afterward. Cleaner, drier, sharper. I noticed years ago that we seemed to get through January with less respiratory trouble when I burned it regularly. I know now that's not coincidence. Aromatic smoke from antimicrobial wood in an enclosed space during the season when people are crowded indoors and pathogens spread most easily is not superstition. It's applied knowledge. They weren't decorating a ritual. They were running a fumigation. Number 6, the costly ointment. John 12:3 describes Mary taking a pound of spikenard, pure, expensive, and anointing Jesus' feet. Mark 14:3 records the disciples' objection. This ointment could have been sold for 300 denarii. That's close to a year's wages for a common laborer. They called it waste. They were wrong about the value, even if they were right about the cost. Spikenard, Nardostachys jatamansi, grows in the high-altitude regions of the Himalayas. Getting it to Judea required a long trade route and significant resources. It was precious because it was genuinely scarce, and because what it did was genuinely valuable. Jatamansone and other sesquiterpene compounds in spikenard root have a long documented history in Ayurvedic and traditional Near Eastern medicine for calming the nervous system, specifically for anxiety, sleeplessness, and pain. I came to spikenard late. I tried the essential oil for the first time only a few years ago. The smell is not what I expected. Earthy, warm, dense, slightly animal. Not sweet, not pretty. But within a few minutes of applying it, something in my chest settled in a way I don't have a better word for. I understood immediately why someone might spend a year's wages on it. Not out of religious sentiment, out of knowing what it did and needing that relief. She poured a year's salary onto his feet. The disciples called it waste. I call it medicine. Number 5, the famous remedy. Jeremiah 8:22 asks one of the most haunting questions in the entire Bible. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then has the health of my people not been restored? That question became a spiritual metaphor, a hymn, a symbol of lost hope. But it only carries that weight because the balm was real. Everyone who heard Jeremiah's question in his own time knew exactly what the balm of Gilead was. They'd seen it work. The balm was a resinous preparation, most likely from Commiphora gileadensis, or a related species native to the region around Gilead, east of the Jordan River. It was so valuable that it was given as a diplomatic gift to pharaohs. It was traded as far as Rome. It was the most sought-after medicinal export from the entire Levantine region for centuries. Used for wound healing, pain relief, and as a general restorative, it fell into a category that modern medicine has largely replaced with synthetic antiseptics and analgesics. When Jeremiah asked if the balm was gone, he wasn't being philosophical. He was watching a society in crisis reach for the medicine that should have been there, and finding that the knowledge of how to produce it, source it, and use it had deteriorated along with everything else. A question about a plant became one of the most quoted spiritual phrases in history because the plant was that important. Number 4, the bitter truth. Wormwood appears in Revelation 8:11 as the name of a star that poisons the waters, a symbol of catastrophe so widely understood that its name alone conveyed total bitterness. It appears in Proverbs 5:4, where the lips of an adulteress are described as bitter as wormwood. In Lamentations 3:15, it's the taste of affliction itself. All of those references work as metaphors because everyone hearing them already knew the taste. Wormwood wasn't exotic or mysterious. It was a plant in common use, a documented antiparasitic and digestive bitter used throughout the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world for thousands of years. Artemisia absinthium, wormwood, contains absinthin and artabsin, compounds with genuine physiological effects on digestion and historically on intestinal parasites. In traditional herbal practice, small measured preparations were used for digestive complaints, particularly those involving sluggish digestion or parasitic infection. The key phrase is small and measured. This is not a plant you use casually or in quantity. Traditional practitioners knew the line. They measured carefully because they understood that the same property that made wormwood useful also made excess dangerous. I grow wormwood at the edge of my garden. It repels insects from neighboring plants. That sharp, volatile quality keeps pests away without spraying anything. The same property, translated internally in small traditional doses, is what made it medicinally relevant. I grow it for the garden's sake. I know it for its history. And I note it here because the fact that the Bible used wormwood as a universal shorthand for suffering means that every person who heard those words tasted it in their memory. Now, most people couldn't pick it out of a lineup. They used it as a metaphor for the worst thing imaginable because everyone had tasted it. Now nobody knows what it is. Number 3, the conception root. Genesis 30:14-16 tells a story that doesn't make sense to most modern readers. Rachel, who has not been able to conceive, sees her nephew Reuben returning from the fields with mandrakes. She wants them badly enough to trade something she values enormously, a night with her husband Jacob, to Leah in exchange for those roots. People read this as superstition, a woman so desperate for a child that she bargains for magic roots. But Rachel was not superstitious. She was informed. Mandrake root, Mandragora officinarum, contains scopolamine and hyoscyamine, alkaloids with genuine physiological activity. Traditional use across the ancient Mediterranean, Near Eastern, and later European medicinal traditions included mandrake for pain relief, sleep induction, and antispasmodic applications relevant to reproductive complaints. The forked shape of the root, resembling a human form, generated centuries of mythology. The pharmacological reality behind the mythology is well documented. I don't grow mandrake, and I'm not recommending its preparation. The same alkaloids that give it medicinal properties make it toxic in doses that are not precisely controlled. Traditional practitioners understood the boundary. They worked within it carefully because they had to. This is historical knowledge, not a practical instruction. But Rachel was a woman who knew her medicine. She recognized something in those roots that was worth a significant price. She didn't trade out of desperation and mythology. She traded because she understood what she was getting. That's a woman who knew her medicine. Before we reach number 1, I want to say something directly. Everything on this list, from hyssop steamed for a chest cold to spikenard applied for sleeplessness to fig poultices laid on infected wounds, required something beyond simply having the plant. It required knowing which part, knowing when, knowing how to prepare it, knowing what to combine it with. The Bible preserved that knowledge inside stories and rituals and laws so embedded in daily life that the knowledge couldn't be separated from the practice without people noticing the loss. We separated them anyway. And now number 1. Number 2, the threshed spice. And here is the plant I promised you near the top, already in your kitchen, used daily by ancient households for pain, fever, and digestion. Isaiah 28:25-27 describes a farmer threshing cumin carefully by hand with a rod rather than a heavy threshing sledge because cumin seeds are delicate. The hull breaks under too much pressure and the volatile oils escape. The ancient farmer knew the difference and adjusted his method to protect what made the plant valuable. Jesus lists cumin among the tithable goods in Matthew 23:23. That's the same list as mint, things counted carefully because they mattered. Cumin was used daily for bloating, for indigestion, for nausea, for respiratory complaints, as a warming digestive aid for heavy meals. The cuminaldehyde and other volatile compounds that give cumin its distinctive smell are the same compounds that make it pharmacologically active as a carminative, a gas-relieving, digestion-supporting herb. I toast cumin seeds in a dry pan until they just begin to pop and smell sharp. Then I steep them in boiling water for 5 minutes and pour the liquid through a strainer. It's one of the simplest things I do. Takes less than 10 minutes, settles a heavy meal faster than anything over the counter in my experience. And it's a preparation that's been used in essentially the same way for 3,000 years. They protected every single seed during threshing, adjusted ancient farming methods to preserve the oils, and counted the seeds carefully enough to tithe them. We shake cumin out of a jar over a pan and don't give it a second thought. Number 1, the tree that holds everything together. You might think we already covered olive oil at number 10. We covered one product of one tree. Number 1 is the tree itself, and why it comes first in understanding everything else on this list. I planted an olive tree 7 years ago. It's growing slowly. Last year it gave me fewer than a dozen olives, but I tend it the same way I tend everything else out here, carefully, patiently, knowing that some things take longer than I might want. The people who planted the ancient groves that fed civilizations for generations didn't plant them expecting the harvest. They planted them for the people who came after. The olive tree in the Bible is not just a food source. Romans 11:17-24 uses it as the central metaphor for continuity, for what is preserved and what is grafted in and what remains. The olive tree provides oil, the carrier for every medicinal preparation. It provides fruit, food dense enough to sustain long travel. It provides wood that burns hot and long, and it provides leaves. Olive leaves were used in traditional medicine for centuries before anyone identified oleuropein, the compound in them with documented antimicrobial and antiviral properties in traditional herbal practice. The leaves can be dried and prepared as a tea. They can be prepared as an extract. They were used this way in folk medicine across the entire Mediterranean region, the same region where the Bible was written and the same plants were growing. But here is what number 1 is really about. Every plant on this list, hyssop, coriander, mint, bitter herbs, frankincense, myrrh, aloe, garlic, onions, leeks, olive oil, figs, pomegranates, cedar, spikenard, balm of Gilead, wormwood, mandrake, cumin, every one of them requires preparation. Hyssop must be steamed, garlic must be crushed and rested, figs must be mashed fresh, pomegranate rind must be dried and decocted. Wormwood must be measured carefully. Spikenard must be applied in the right form. Not one of these plants works by possession alone. That is the principle the olive tree embodies. The people who grew it, harvested it, pressed it, burned its wood, steeped its leaves, and preserved the oil for medicinal use understood that the value was not in the tree itself. The value was in the knowledge of what to do with the tree. The ancients didn't have pharmacies. They had knowledge. They planted it, tended it, passed it down, and built entire civilizations around it. The dried hyssop bundle I picked up this morning smells exactly the same as it smelled in my grandmother's garden and in her mother's garden before that. The plant hasn't changed. What's changed is how many people know what to do when they hold one. These plants didn't heal people by being exotic or miraculous or beyond explanation. They healed people because people knew them, their names, their smells, their seasons, their preparations, which part to use and when and how. That intimacy with living plants is what we've lost, not the plants themselves, the knowing. So here's what I'd ask you to do with this list. Pick one plant. 1. Maybe hyssop because you can grow it on a windowsill. Maybe garlic because you already have it. Maybe cumin because there's a jar of it 3 feet away from you right now and all you need is water and heat. Grow it or find it or learn one preparation. That's all. Just one. And tell me in the comments, which of these 20 plants are you starting with? Which one did your family use that you'd forgotten about until just now? This knowledge weighs nothing, it needs no charging, and it'll still be growing in your garden long after every app you own has been updated out of existence.